Here, and this morning we're going to be reading from John 11. So if you want to go there now, that would be great. But before we get there, I want to tell you a little bit about what I heard, something I heard this week. So this week I was driving from Brandon and I just put on the radio. I heard the tail end of a blog. So I didn't hear the whole thing. I just heard the last part of it about a billionaire couple named Barry and Honey Sherman. They were found dead in their mansion in Toronto 5.5 years ago. Barry Sherman owned Apotex. It's a pharmaceutical company worth billions. And his wife, Honey, was a well-loved and endearing philanthropist, giving away some of the money that was being made through Apotex. So they were found bound and gagged next to their indoor pool. No one has been charged. And this whole 5 years of not knowing is a quagmire of lawsuits, finger pointing, and family breakdown. There's a book. There's a couple of blogs. There's a whodunit mystery series on one of the networks. And at the end of this blog that I was listening to on the radio, the narrator said, "And there is no God. There is nothing other than what we have here. We start out, we just evolve, and then we end." So 1 second, the blogger was talking about the Shermans and the fact that their deaths have never been explained. And the very next second, the blogger was stating his philosophical bias. There is no God. We evolve to a certain level, and then we are done. So I heard this excerpt the same week that I was reading a book by Tim Keller called Encounters with Jesus. Tim Keller was an adult convert to the Christian faith, a church planter in downtown Manhattan, New York. And in his 50s, he was a very prolific author. Keller died this May at the age of 72, and he is often compared to C.S. Lewis because he had the ability to speak to skeptics and intellectuals about the reality of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Keller believed, is that me? Going to work better? I'm sorry about that. So Tim Keller wrote a lot of books, and he loved to talk about two intellectuals and atheists about Jesus Christ. And Keller believed that every person who encountered... Thanks, Ben. Ben's giving me some direction here. There, thank you. It's good when you can take advice from your husband about a necklace. Thanks. Keller believed that every person who encountered Jesus in the gospel stories was changed or affected or influenced. And he wrote a lot of chapters to describe these encounters that Jesus had with individual people. And then Keller's argument that we still encounter Jesus in our modern day life. So the scripture that we're going to go to is in John 11, and it's the story of the raising of Lazarus. And I want you to listen very specifically to what Jesus says to Martha, and then also what Jesus says to Mary. So either read along or just enjoy this beautiful story and listen to what Jesus says to the sisters. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick, and he was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." And when he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. And yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you're going back there?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light." After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, called Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. And when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." And Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." And Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life, and he who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who was to come into the world." And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still out at the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who had opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen, and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Tim Keller includes this story in one of the chapters in this book that I was telling you about. And he makes the point that Jesus' response to Mary and Martha was very different, because Mary and Martha were completely different. Martha tells Jesus that he came too late, and Jesus tells Martha he is the resurrection and the life. And with him, he's never too late. Martha is despairing and hopeless, and Jesus seems to give her a little bit of a gentle rebuke in order to instill hope. And Jesus' response to Mary is not a rebuke or a rebuttal, but a very emotional entering into Mary's sadness. He bursts into tears, weeps with all of the people weeping, and then asks, "Where have you laid him?" Jesus responded to each sister based on his relationship with them and with what they needed. Mary needed a little bit of a theological reproach. She needed to hear the truth about who Jesus is. Martha needed a reproach. Mary needed a good cry. Jesus joined her in her grief without so much as even giving her some theological comfort. But more central to this story about Mary and Martha is something extraordinary, that Jesus is saying that he is the resurrection and the life. Jesus is saying to this family and all the Jews who are gathered, "I am God." And Jesus is saying he has a way to make meaning out of death, meaning out of despair, and meaning out of grief. And from where we're sitting here, that seems sort of obvious because that's what we've based our faith on. But that wasn't true for them. First century Jews had a view of God that was so magnificent and transcendent that they even refused to write God's name using letters. They refused to say God's name out loud. It was too overwhelming. God was too holy for even an identification such as that. So then, how did Jesus' followers make the shift? Thinking of God as so otherworldly that I can't even say his name, to believing in this man wearing sandals, a teacher who shows up late for the funeral. They had to make this extraordinary shift from thinking that God is so holy that he is unapproachable, to believing that God is in Jesus, right in our midst, walking, caring for us. And this is Jesus, claiming to be God, and then breaking down in tears at the death of his friend Lazarus. 100% divine, 100% human. So Jesus responds to Martha with what Keller calls the ministry of truth. And that is what she needs right at that moment. Jesus gives Mary the ministry of tears, stepping into her grief with complete compassion and integrity. No words, just tears. And I want to read an excerpt from the book because it just caught me this week, and I want to share it with you, and I pray that it is a blessing to you. From this chapter by Keller. Now, frankly, everybody needs a ministry of truth and a ministry of tears at different times. Sometimes you need more of the bracing truth. You need to be shaken by a loving friend who says, "Wake up, look around you." Other times you really just need someone to weep with you. Sometimes to lay truth on people when they're grieved is absolutely wrong. But other times just to weep with them and not tell them the truth is equally wrong. None of us has the temperament or the patience or the insight to give people exactly what they need all of the time. Some of us have personalities that are prone to confront, even when sympathy is called for. And others of us are the opposite. But Jesus Christ is never strong when he should be tender, or tender when he should be strong. Yet it isn't just that he is the perfect, wonderful counselor. He is the truth itself, come in tears. He is deity incarnate in the flesh. So some Bibles use the words deeply troubled when Jesus approached the tomb. And some Bibles describe Jesus as wailing as he approaches the tomb. And these are strong, strong emotions. And Jesus expressed these very strong emotions a little bit later on. As the story evolves, we go from Lazarus to the Jews to the high priests and anger at Jesus claiming to be God. And then that's where we're going to pick up the story now. We're going to read in John 12. And this is after the triumphal entry, another parade that is evidence that Jesus is God. And the high priests are just livid. So you can imagine the anger that is happening around this. But let's pick up this story in John 12, verse 20. Now there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the feast. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. Sir, they said, we would like to see Jesus. Philip went to tell Andrew, and Andrew and Philip in turn told Jesus. And Jesus replied, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. I tell you the truth, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. The man who loves his life will lose it, while the man who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant also will be. My Father will honor the one who serves me. Now my heart is troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. No, it was for this very reason that I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. And then a voice came from heaven. I have glorified it, and will glorify it again. The crowd that was there and heard it said it was thunder. Others said an angel had spoken to him. And Jesus said, this voice was for your benefit, not mine. Now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. But I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. And the crowd spoke up. We have heard from the law that the Christ will remain forever. So how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? And then Jesus told them, you are going to have the light just a little while longer. Walk while you have the light, before darkness overtakes you. The man who walks in the dark does not know where he is going. Put your trust in the light while you have it, so that you may become the sons and daughters of light. And when he had finished speaking, Jesus left and hid himself from them. Troubled, but not overcome. Jesus is not naive to the wretchedness and evil and the wickedness of humanity. He will die at the hands of a mob and under the watch of men who are scared and worried about their own reputations, their own positions of power and authority. So let me come back to the story of the Shermans and make I just have a few thoughts. If you don't believe in God, and the podcaster stated that he didn't, then the tragedy is just that. It's a tragedy, a mystery, a heart-wrenching example of greed, power, violence, and murder, with no greater understanding of evil and wickedness. And this event in history, in Canadian history, and it's pretty dramatic for Canada, we're not known for billionaire murderers. This story just becomes another example that the world is going to hell in a handbasket. And I don't mean that as profanity, and I don't mean that flippantly, but often people who aren't people of faith use that kind of language. And there's the catch. If you don't believe in God, then you don't believe in heaven. And if you don't believe in heaven, then you also cannot fathom a hell. And how can you say if something is evil if you don't believe in that which is good? And God is good. So I have heard a few of my Christian friends bemoan the state of our world. There's so much polarization, confusion, outright wickedness. So much of the misery of life here on earth is due to selfishness, pride, cruelty, anger, oppression, war, and violence. And this is not news to Jesus. Because God has been here before the world began. And God is not perplexed nor dumbfounded at the condition of our world today. And God, in Jesus, weeps with those who are brokenhearted and despairing. And Jesus also proclaims his truth. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the light that guides in the darkness. So at the end of the podcast, as I'm driving along, it just comes to an abrupt end. And when the narrator said there was no God, I just kind of felt this sense of, emptiness, futility. I heard a bit of self-righteousness in his pronouncement. A horrific event with no meaning behind it all, tied up, secured with a bow. That's how I felt he was doing it. Wrapping it up. This is final. This is the end. There's nothing more. And then I came home and I opened the scriptures and I read this account of Jesus entering a family's pain and agony. And I just realized again that belief in Jesus gives meaning to death. Belief in Jesus gives meaning to our sufferings and the things that make us sad. And faith in God provides the strength when everything else seems futile. Faith in God provides the strength that you need for whatever it is that makes you kneel in prayer. Sometimes we're like Martha, and we need the truth of the word spoken to us. And sometimes we're like Mary. We just need someone to weep with us or come alongside us, hear our story, and offer some encouragement. And we are all like Lazarus. Death is not the end. Jesus is the resurrection and the life. And for our short time here on earth, Jesus helps us to walk in that light. I pray that God blesses the reading of his word this morning.